Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started. It is August. We are diving into our summer form series, into our seller forms. We're going to have a little delay though. Next week, we don't have class. So next week's class is canceled. So we will start in today on the residential listing agreement. We'll pick it up in 2 weeks. So anybody have any questions before we dive in this morning? All right, fabulous. I have the residential listing agreement pulled up. This question got asked previously with the, I think it was purchase agreement or the buyer rep agreement. But when you go into your car forms library, you type in RLA, there's two. One of them has a little dot before it. It's the residential listing agreement exclusive with a little dot, and one of them doesn't. It doesn't matter which one, they're exactly the same. The only difference is they put a dot before this one so that it shows up at the top of the list alphabetically. So we've had that question before, so just some clarity there. And we always want to use the exclusive RLA form. So keep that in mind as well. There's some other options that are non-exclusive. Just like I encourage you guys to check the box on the BRBC for exclusive. Same thing here with our listing agreement. We always want to use the exclusive version. What this does is this sets you up that anytime you have a listing, that listing sells because anybody brings a buyer, the buyer found it, doesn't matter how, you're going to receive the compensation for representing the seller in that transaction. If it's not the exclusive, you actually have to be responsible and prove that you're responsible for like bringing the buyer. So, exclusive, I actually think it states in our independent contractor agreement that exclusive is the form that we're required to use. So if you have any questions or want to attempt to use a different one, you would need to have a conversation with Ed and Kara about that. All right. Diving into our listing agreement, it starts with the agency disclosure. I've already covered this a couple of times. I'm not going to cover it again, except to say that just this talks about the different ways a client can be represented in a transaction, either as a seller with a seller's agent, a buyer as a buyer's agent, or dual agency where the buyer or where the agent represents both the buyer and the seller, or even the brokerage. Wah, wah, wah. That would be dual agency. Seller and buyer responsibilities are at the bottom. Everybody signs it. You're going to sign this multiple times during the transaction. Listing, not as much, probably just once. Buyers usually sign it at least twice. You would check the box here for seller. Seller's names go here, and you would sign away. Second page is just the legal jargon for that agency disclosure. I'm going to skip ahead real quick. We're going to skip the listing agreement, head down to the bottom. There's some attached forms to the listing agreement. So I'm going to get down there. We're going to cover the multiple listing service addendum at the end. I just want to see what else is down here because we have that one, which basically goes along with the listing agreement. So those two are really coupled together. You have your disclosure and consent for possible representation of more than one seller and dual agency in a transaction. So remember, they changed this form in June. So now there's one for buyers and there's one for sellers. So this is the new form talking about the fact that, hey, we're going to represent multiple sellers at the same time. We're not going to steer our buyers to one property versus another. We're going to market them all equally. We're going to attempt to find buyers for all of our listings. And then it talks about here, it breaks down dual agency between broker dual agency, where the brokerage represents both the buyer and the seller, right? So I've got the seller, Adriana's got the buyer. That would be brokerage dual agency versus single agent dual agency, where I'm representing the seller on the listing, and then the buyer also wants to write the offer with me. So it talks about those different forms here. And then it talks about here that, hey, we may also represent prospective buyers, dual agency, right? So it just acknowledges again, and then they sign it. Okay, so that's our disclosure and consent for possible representation of more than one seller and dual agency in a transaction. Okay, again, I will state it again just so everybody has heard me, especially for our newer agents. I highly don't recommend single agent dual agency. Okay, where you're representing both the buyer and the seller. There's very few transactions that I would say, yeah, you're okay to do that. Most transactions, I would not recommend it, because how do you protect the best interests of your sellers, which is to sell their house for the most amount of money in terms that are agreeable to them and favor them? And then how do you represent a buyer, which is to get the best deal on a property at terms that are favorable to the buyer, right? Even when it comes down to like negotiating things like repair requests and stuff, like it just becomes a lot of gray area. It's a tight rope to walk, and it's going to result in problems down the road. So if you have a listing and you are hosting the open house, buyer comes in, wants to write an offer, my recommendation would be to refer that to another agent in our office for that offer. So refer that buyer over, collect that referral fee off of it, so you're not out everything. Collect that referral fee, let them write the offer and represent the buyer. So then we would just have brokerage dual agency versus single agent dual agency. So the other form that's attached to your residential listing agreement is your disclosure information advisory. This is a fabulous form. I was sending this out to my sellers long before it was required, because this is, in my opinion, the best form in our entire car forms library. Not because of what it tells them to do, but just the way that they've worded this form. It's very user friendly and very understandable, so I like it. This form just talks about to sellers how they need to make sure they disclose everything regarding the property. So it talks about the fact that they're required to provide things like the TDS, the seller property questionnaire, an exempt seller disclosure, those disclosure forms. And then it talks about reading this document carefully, ask questions, preparing to complete your disclosures. Talks about, hey, review all questions on the disclosure form. Make sure you understand what information is being requested. While the seller doesn't have the duty to investigate, you may have received disclosures that the property may have been revealed or posted, recorded information, material facts, right? Social media, blogs, personal websites, Facebook advertisements, or received documents, correspondence from a homeowners association. Use any known available documentation to refresh your memory about past and current issues, conditions, problems, right? It just talks about everything they're supposed to disclose. Allow yourself plenty of time to fully complete the disclosure forms, right? Your knowledge may only be based upon what you've been told orally, right? Um, or or received in writing. Dun, dun, dun. Keep in mind that if your neighbor told you something, they're likely to tell the new owner the same information after the transaction closes, right? So just, hey, make sure you disclose everything. If you're unsure if something should be disclosed, you should probably disclose it. That's there on line F. If you don't want to disclose a piece of information about the property, think about your reasoning of why you don't want to disclose this information. If the answer is because you think that the buyer will not want to buy the property or will want to purchase at a lower price, that is exactly the reason why the fact ought to be disclosed. It materially affects the value or desirability of the property. So, anyways, I just think this is a fabulous form. Again, it's attached to the listing agreement, so we can't take it off. So it's required to be there. 3 is instructions for completing those, right? Do not leave any questions blank anytime you mark yes. Make sure there's an explanation, right? This is fabulous. Just so you know, this form as well, if you're sending out your disclosures as part of disclosures, I know it's not disclosures out, Glide. If you're sending your disclosures out through Glide, which we have access to, they basically restate this form in the instructions before they start answering questions on those disclosures. Consider issues, conditions, problems that may impact your property, even if they're not necessarily on your property, right? Even if you've learned to live with an issue, condition, or problem, disclose it. Even if you believe it's been repaired, resolved, or stopped, disclose the issue and what has been done. Don't speculate, predict, or guarantee. Okay. Don't assume that you know the answers to all questions. Right? Like if you didn't receive copies of permits, do not assume that anyone that did the work on the property obtained permits. Okay. And if you're relying on written or oral information you receive for someone else, even if you disagree with the information or unsure about its truth, disclose and identify the source of the information. So much good stuff. You guys should be going over this form with your sellers before they fill out their disclosures. Here it talks about the different types of disclosures. So they've really spelled it out. Hey, what's in section 1, section 2, section 2, or 2A, 2B, and 2C. Seller property questionnaire. What does it entail? The exempt seller disclosure. Okay, it also talks about why somebody might be exempt. And then final recommendation. Okay. Strongly recommend the following points. This is what we're recommending to our sellers, that if you're aware of any planned or possible changes to your neighbor's property, addition, changes to the neighborhood, such as new construction, road changes that may affect traffic, views, noise levels, or other issues, conditions, problems, disclose those plans, proposed changes, disclose any lawsuits, whether filed in the past, presently filed, or expected to be filed. Even if you believe the case has been resolved, include as much detail. If any disclosure that has been made becomes inadequate, incomplete, or accurate, or changes occur over time, including right up to the close of escrow, you should update and correct the disclosure forms in a timely fashion, right? We can always update those with an addendum to the disclosure forms. If you have any questions about the applicability of law to the property, the listing broker recommends that you consult with a qualified California real estate attorney. If you need help regarding what information to disclose, how to disclose it, or what changes need to be made to your disclosure forms, consult a qualified California real estate attorney. While limited exemptions, limited exceptions may exist, such as questions that may impact fair housing and discrimination laws. Generally speaking, when in doubt, the best answer to the question of do I need to disclose is almost always yes, disclose it. Okay, so that's our DIA form. It's my favorite. It's now attached to the listing agreement. It didn't used to be, but it's one of my favorite forms in our car forms library. We have our broker compensation form, which is also attached to the listing agreement, right? Talks about that compensation is fully negotiable. Optional additional compensation if buyer is unrepresented, right? That's one of the options that we'll talk about in our listing agreement. And it just talks about why the seller would want to agree to that. Brokerage may represent both seller and buyer in dual agency. Broker agreements with buyer representation, right? So this is the top sections for sellers. Section 2 is for buyers. We talked about that section already. And section 3 is how the compensation can be paid for buyer's representation. Okay, I'm surprised sellers haven't come back and said, oh, instead of this, we're going to ask the buyer's agent to pay our portion of the compensation. Changing practices related, so it just talks about the settlement there. So, right, so it goes into the history of compensation and how it can be paid. The next form that's attached to our listing agreement is the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. Again, we can't discriminate based on any of the protected classes, so this form goes out to them. It also tells them where to go if they feel like they've been discriminated against. And then we have our seller's advisory here. This is like the buyer's advisory, but it just talks about, hey, here's the introduction. Selling a property involves very many steps, right? You've got disclosures, your general disclosure duties, your statutory duties. That talks about the NHD report, the TDS. Okay. So it just goes through there. Death and other disclosures. Okay, many consider it a material fact in the purchase, right? You don't have to talk about how the death occurred. Your condos and other common interest subdivisions need to get disclosed. Contract terms and legal requirements. It's just talking about here, like, hey, the buyer may request repairs. Seller is not obligated to do so. Withholding taxes under federal and California laws, the buyer is required to withhold a portion of the purchase price from your sale proceeds for tax purposes unless you sign an affidavit of non-foreign status and California residency or some other exemption applies and is documented. prohibition against discrimination, government required repairs, replacements, and alterations, EPAs, right, are lead-based paint for properties before 1978. All cash entity buyers were required to report such things to the title. Well, normally the title company takes over that reporting obligation. And then you've got wholesale buyers, which is that assigning of the contract where they might assign it for a higher price and collect some of those funds they're required to disclose. Legal, tax, and other implications, they should consult a tax professional. Marketing considerations. So if you want to talk about pre-sale inspections and considerations, it's here in 4A. Open houses. Are we going to hold an open house or not? Post-sale protections as far as like removing things from online or whatnot. Oh, sorry. This is more of just protecting yourself after the sale from potential lawsuits. This is more of, hey, you may want to provide a home warranty. So if the buyer asks for a home warranty, this is a good paragraph to reference here, this 4C, which talks about, hey, you may want to offer that home protection warranty. Make event something goes wrong after sale, it's covered by the plan instead of them coming after you. Safety precautions. Okay, just talking about, hey, advertising and marketing includes, but not limited to, holding open houses, lock boxes, for sale signs, put photographs, videotapes, virtual tours, may jeopardize your personal safety of that and the property. Strongly encouraged to maintain insurance and take all possible precautions and safeguards to protect yourself, other occupants, visitors to your property, belongings, cash, jewelry, drugs, firearms, and other valuables. Expenses, you're advised that you, not the broker, are responsible for fees and costs, if any, to comply with your duties and obligations to the buyer of your property, and then other items. So seller's advisory, this is also a good form. Remember that one. And then your California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, ultimately stating that, hey, as a real estate agent or as a transaction, we don't have control over what gets disseminated out. We can pull information back, but it may still stay out there on other sites. So those are the forms that are attached to the residential listing agreement. Any question about any of those forms before we dive into the listing agreement? And because, again, these are attached, they're marked in the listing agreement, you can't take them away. We can't just send out the listing agreement for sale without these forms attached to it. All right, let's dive into our listing agreement. Here is our listing agreement. Again, always the exclusive listing agreement. You're going to put a date prepared in the upper left-hand corner. Again, this is the date that any other documents are going to reference when we're making any changes or modifications to the listing agreement. This is where you're going to put the seller's name here. Seller 1, seller 2. And remember, if you have more than 2 sellers, you're going to use an additional signature addendum. Okay, you check that at the end of this listing agreement. I had 4 sellers at one point. You've got to use the additional signature addendum for anything over 2 sellers. You're going to put the brokerage name here. This has it because I use this for the buyer's form, so it just auto-populated this information here, but this would be Realty One Group Fox. Okay, you're going to put the property address here, city, state or county. It's already got the state and the zip code. And then you're also going to put the parcel number. Remember, the parcel number is actually the legally identifying information for the property. The address is the common name. And always want to make sure you put circle, street, drive, road, court, whatever it might be, parkway there, because there might be 175 Carlsbad Street and 175 Carlsbad Circle. So we want to make sure to put both of them and always make sure to put that APN in there. Okay, the next section is what we call the grid. Just like the purchase agreement and just like the buyer representation, there is a grid for our listing agreement where most of the information goes. And then again, just like what we covered as the residential purchase agreement, this is section 2A, 2A1, 2A2, 2B, 2C, right? So the first column references section 2, what section of section 2 is being referenced. The next column here, so when we see 2A1, it then says 4G. That's where we would go for more information about the listing period. We would scroll down to paragraph or section 4, item G, and we would find more information regarding that. So same thing here, like 2C1, it's 4B, so we would find more information under section 4B. Okay, first section is listing period. It begins on blank date and ends on blank date. It's not to exceed 24 months if improved with 1 to 4 units and not owned by an entity. If listing period exceeds 24 months on a residential 1 to 4 units, this agreement is void. So not just, hey, it actually expires in 24 months, it's actually void. Okay, now that doesn't apply if the seller is a corporation, an LLC, or a partnership, because those same protections don't apply to businesses. Okay, so, or to entities. So not to exceed. So like if we were going to say, hey, it's going to start today, we could go all the way to August 6, 2028. Okay. I would actually probably go, just to be safe, I would probably go the day before. Oh, 08, 05, 20. Oh, sorry, 28 is what I meant there. So that takes you 2 years. That's the longest. I don't ever do my listing agreements for 2 years. My intention is not to hold this listing for 2 years. Now, that being said, please get listing agreements signed for properties that aren't yet ready to go on the market. Maybe they're doing some work, you're consulting with them to help them prepare the house for sale. Get the listing agreement signed. That's where we might take it out a little bit longer because we don't know what our target on market date is. Or we might have an idea. Maybe they're thinking it's going to take 6 or 8 months to finish repairs or upgrades, and then they're going to put it on the market or whatever that might be. Then we might go a little longer because we're not going on the market yet, even though it's going to begin on today's date. Okay, don't delay in getting listing agreements signed. Listing price is going to go here. Now, we usually put the listing price. Remember, the seller's in charge of the listing price. Okay, they don't attach the market conditions advisory to this anymore. I like the market conditions advisory because it talks about that the market's cyclical and the seller ultimately is responsible for what the property is going to get listed for. Without a listing price here, this is invalid. If we have a situation where we're not going on the market for 8 months, I'm going to put the listing price here, conservative number of, hey, and I'm going to explain to the seller, if we were going to put the market on or the property on the market today, this would be the list price in its current condition, right? What we're going to do is once you've completed the repairs or once you've done the upgrades, we'll come back and revisit this. And I'm actually going to document that down in the other terms. So down here in additional terms, I would put list price to be revisited within 2 weeks of on market date or of marketing to the public. Okay. So that's how I handle that. I like to put a conservative number here if that's the case. If it's getting ready to go on the market, then we need to have a conversation with the seller. Seller needs to be in agreement of what this number is that we're putting here. If it's going to be, so 2B is if it's a manufactured or mobile home, or if it's in probate, conservatorship, guardianship. Okay, if we check this box, it's going to attach the MHLA, which is the mobile home listing addendum. Or if we check this box here, now it's going to attach the probate listing addendum. Okay, so that would be right if the seller has passed away and the estate's handling it or the court's handling the sale, or again, if it's manufactured or mobile. And this doesn't matter, this manufactured or mobile doesn't matter whether it's in a rented space or owned land. We're going to check that box if it's a manufactured home, right? Not stick built from the ground up on the property. C is the compensation section. Again, we want to make sure they understand that the amount of real estate or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They're set by each broker individually and may be negotiated between seller and broker. See attached broker compensation advisory. Remember, we already talked about that form. C1 is compensation to seller's broker. This is where you're going to put in either a percent. Okay, there. You can also go a percent and. Okay, so if we filled in an item here, it's not going to let me put in a letter. I can't put in a number because that would cause problems. And then we would put in a dollar amount here. Okay, if we wanted and. So this is a percent and. So both of these numbers would get paid to you when you sold the property. The other option is this or here, which is a box, and this would be a flat rate. So instead of a percent, we would fill out the flat rate. So those are your two options there. The other option is see attached broker created compensation schedule. So maybe you want to have a compensation schedule attached, and maybe it's which package do you want? Do you want basic services? Do you want the upgraded, or do you want the all-inclusive? We take care of everything. There's staging, there's right. So maybe you have something like that. Or maybe you have it set up a compensation schedule where if we sell it at list price, it's X%. If we sell it a certain percentage below the original list price, then I take this compensation. Or if we sell it above this 20% over list, then I get this compensation, right? So maybe you have it set up that way, or maybe you have it set up that, hey, if the purchase price is 0 to 300,000, I get X flat amount. If it's 300,000 to 500,000, I get X%. If it's 500,000 to 800,000, I get X%, right? So you can set it up so many different ways to use the compensation schedule. Okay, you can use it like a menu or like a graduated payment schedule. So however you want to set that up, you can do that. So again, we would do either the percent, the flat rate, or the compensation schedule. We can't do a percent and compensation schedule. And you notice that if I check this box, everything else whites out. You can't select those. If I select this box, everything else takes away. Okay, the percent is above is based on the purchase price if seller and buyer sign a purchase agreement. So whatever that purchase price is, it's not the actual list price. C2 is additional compensation to seller's broker for additional effort needed to facilitate transaction if buyer is not represented by a real estate agent. Okay, this isn't dual agency. This is buyer comes, writes their own offer. They don't have an agent. Okay, so if we want that, we would select that box. I recommend it. I think it's good practice. It's very rare that you get an offer from an unrepresented agent, but sometimes you do, or an unrepresented buyer. But sometimes you do, especially if you've got like a fixer-upper or something, you might have an investor that writes their own offers. And then here is the additional percentage that you would get if the buyer doesn't have representation. Okay. So you can decide there, and you have the same choices here. It's percent and additional amount. Then you've got a flat rate amount, and then you've got broker created compensation schedule. If broker is not representing buyer, broker is advised to provide the unrepresented buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement, a BNA form.
Amy,
And yes.
sorry, that section doesn't have to be filled out right away, right?
This section does not have to be filled out at all. However, if a buyer then makes an offer that is not represented and you're not going to represent them as part of the transaction, trying to come back and renegotiate that at that time is going to be more difficult. I would set yourself up for success and fill it out at time of listing agreement instead of trying to modify the listing agreement down the road.
Okay.
Yeah. But it does not have to be filled out. Bottom section here, if broker represents both buyer and seller, broker must obtain separate written agreement with the buyer that establishes the broker's right to compensation for buyer side of transaction. So this isn't dual agency. This is buyer does not have an agent. And the reason that we would get additional compensation, again, it's listed on the seller's or the broker compensation advisory or the seller's advisory. I don't remember which one. I think the seller's advisory just talks about the fact that we're going to have to do extra work. This buyer's not going to have forms. We're going to have to be facilitating, make sure they get stuff turned back and that they're removing contingencies, right? We're doing all that work, although we're not representing them, so we don't owe them that like confidentiality and stuff, but we still are going to have to do more legwork for them. So that's why we would get additional compensation there. C3 is continued right to compensation for broker involved or identified prospective buyers. The continuation period shall be blank calendar days after listing period for any extension or any extension. That's the continuation period. Okay, I would highly recommend you put something here, 30, 60, 90, whatever you're comfortable with. What this does is, hey, if this listing agreement expires or if we decide to cancel the listing agreement, 30 days after this, any broker identified prospective buyers, right? So any buyers that saw the property while we had it listed, if the seller decided to turn around and sell it to one of those buyers, we would be due compensation. It's there to protect you. It's there so that we don't have a buyer come see a property, interact with the seller because they were driving by it on a Saturday afternoon and the seller was outside and they stopped by and rolled down the window and said, "Hey, why don't you cancel out of your listing agreement so you don't have to pay your agent any compensation? We'll do this on the side." Or maybe the neighbor comes to them and says, "Hey, my mom would like to buy your property, so I'm just going to write an offer directly to you. So get out of your listing agreement so that we can negotiate this without your agent involved and save you some money." This is there to protect you that, hey, your sign was in the yard. That's why they saw the property for sale. You hosted open houses, whatever it might be. You did work for these sellers. And we don't want them turning around and selling the property to somebody who saw it while you had it listed without you being compensated for your time, energy, and effort. We don't want them cutting you out of the deal. So that's your continuation of right to compensation. C4 is seller's obligation to pay previous brokers. So if the seller previously had the property listed, they canceled out of it, but they're due for, right, maybe that broker identified prospective buyers, we would list the other brokerages here and then what compensation is owed if the property is transferred. So to the list of sellers, whatever that might be, we would put it there. If the broker, so if we're paying a referral fee related to the representation of the seller, we would check this box here and we would include form RAD. Okay, and that is our referral disclosure form, just stating that, hey, like you referred to me from another brokerage, so they're receiving a referral fee as part of this transaction. Okay. Items to be in any questions so far about sections A, B, or C? And if you guys do have questions, you are welcome to just do what Adriana did and unmute yourself and ask your question. Or I do have the chat box open as well. I'm trying to pay attention to that too. All right, diving into section D. This is items intended to be included or excluded. Okay, so remember though here that just because it's intended, if it's not in the purchase agreement, it doesn't matter. So here's items that we intend to include. So this might be like washer, dryer, refrigerator. Things intending to exclude. Maybe we're planning to remove the shed in the backyard. Okay, or the cabinets in the garage. Leased items. What items do they have on the property that is not owned by the seller? Things like propane tanks, solar systems, water softeners, alarm systems. There's also a blank there. What's liened, right? The difference between a lease and a lien is a lease is I don't actually own it. I'm making payments to somebody else for something that I don't actually own. And then a liened item is, hey, I'm making payments on it. There's a lien against the property. So these items need to be paid off or assumed by the buyer. But there's dollar amounts still owed on it. So that would be a liened item. Okay, something recorded against the property or that is attached to the house that you're still making payments on. Sometimes we're still making payments on things like our heating and HVAC system, but it's not actually recorded against the property, right? So that wouldn't technically be a liened item, but it's those questions that you want to have with your seller so that you know, because the seller's not going to want to move out of that property and continue paying for the HVAC system for the buyer. D5 is smart home features seller prefers to include, or smart home features seller prefers to exclude. Things like your Ring doorbells, your Nest thermostats, those types of things might be included. Maybe you've got smart plugs, right? Property will be marketed in the following MLS. Here's the primary and here's the other. And you would then see car form MLSA, which we will be covering as well. SA. Okay. Primary, and keep in mind too that because we have Barry's Plus or MetroList Plus, that if it's a property in Sacramento, I would put primary is going to be MetroList. We're going to input it into Barry's, but it's going to mark it as primary out of MetroList because we'll co-opt with them. And then the others, I would say, hey, it's going to be marketed in the Barry's system. It's going to be marketed to the San Francisco, Contra Costa, right? Everywhere Barry's Plus disseminates that information, that's where I would put in the others. Okay. E2, publication of seller willingness to consider concessions. If checked below, seller authorizes broker to market that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions, and no amount of the possible concession will be stated in such marketing unless seller notifies broker in writing of the amount in the MLS listed above, if permitted by the MLS, or in any other marketing outside of the MLS, right? So is the seller willing to do concessions? Maybe the seller's like, hey, yeah, the carpet's really gross. Like, we're willing to do, a $5,000 concession to the buyer to help replace the carpet. Then perfect. Can we put that in the MLS, or can we put it in other marketing? And if it's going to be a specific dollar amount, we need to spell that out somewhere in the agreement. Otherwise, it might just be, yeah, I'm willing to like help pay for closing costs, or I'm willing to pay for some money towards the carpet replacement. We haven't identified a specific number. We don't want to use specifics when we talk about it. So that's E2. E3 is seller instructs broker to not take or use photographs in marketing except as required by MLS rules. MLS rules state that it must have a picture of the front of the house. Okay, if we're not going to take photos, we need to have a conversation with a seller about how that limits the exposure of the property. But some people may like that, so we would check that box there. Timing and presentation of offers. Seller instructs broker to present all offers received as soon as practical, right? So that would be like, hey, we received an offer today. Seller, when are you available for me to present this offer to you? Or is there going to be a specific day and time after the property is listed? Okay, some agents make it common practice that, hey, we're going to leave the property on the market for a week before we present offers, just so we don't have those people like rushing in at all hours of the day trying to get in to see it in the first 24 hours on market. So you could go, hey, it's going to go 7 days after the property is listed as active on the MLS, right? So you could do something to that effect. Buyer supplemental offer letters. These would be buyer letters, right? Our love letters. Seller instructs broker to not present buyer letters is the default, or seller instructs broker to present buyer letters. If seller requests or relies on buyer letters, seller is acting against broker advice because they could be seen as discriminating. So if we check the box here, then we have to present those letters. If we don't check the box, then we're saying we're not presenting buyer letters before we make a decision on the offer. F3 is investigation reports. We have our NHD report is already checked. Are they getting a pest control, a property inspection, homeowners association documents, preliminary title report, roof, pool, septic, sewer, other. Okay, so we would check whatever pre-listing inspections we want there. Maybe we're going to open pre-escrow and have that preliminary title report. Maybe we want those HOA documents, right? Whatever that might be. Whether ordered by seller or broker pursuant to paragraph 7A, seller shall pay for any reports selected within 5 days of the beginning date of this agreement. Keep in mind, you may want to adjust this if we're not going on the market right away or not getting those inspections taken care of. Or if you're going to pay for those inspection reports, you can note that down here on additional terms, because maybe you're going to put listing agent to reimburse seller for any pre-listing investigation reports at close of escrow, right? So maybe we're asking the seller to pay for them up front and we're just going to reimburse them for those. Maybe you're going to pay for them up front. You'd want to note that under additional terms. G is exceptions to ownership or title, right? Anybody else on titles? Anybody got first right of refusal, whatever that might be, we would put it there. Seller intends to include a contingency to purchase replacement property as part of the transactions. Okay, we would check that box if that's the case. Seller opt-outs, are they opting out of a key safe or a lockbox, or are they opting out of a sign? Again, signs, we have listings to get them sold and to generate leads. So we like to have signs in the yard, and key safe lock boxes. Those make it easy for us. so that somebody doesn't have to be there to let potential agents in that want to show the property. And then K is additional terms. I've already mentioned a few things that you may want to put in there. Any questions about the grid on the listing agreement? All right. Moving right along. Section 3 is advisories or addendums. We have our broker compensation advisory, or BCA, is already checked. We can't uncheck it. If it's a bank-owned property, we'd want to use the REO advisory listing. If it's a trust in a trust, we'd want to use the trust advisory. Or if there's something extra that we want to include that's an advisory, we would put it here under other. Okay, we have advisories and we have addendums. So here's your advisories. The next section, 3B, is addendums. The following addendas identified are incorporated into this agreement. That would be like our short sale listing addendum, our SSLA. Let's see, we have REOL, TA, and SSLA. All right. These next set, starting here with section 4, it just goes into more details on the things that were in the grid. So section 4 is compensation to brokerage, right? The advisory, it's fully negotiable. Seller agrees to pay broker as compensation for services under the agreement, the amount specified in 2C1. That's what we put in the grid. Optional additional compensation for unrepresented buyers, right? If no other brokerage company is involved in the sale of seller's property because buyer's not represented by a real estate agent, seller agrees to pay broker the additional amount specified in paragraph 2C if checked for services rendered. Broker is advised to confirm that they are not representing the buyer, providing the unrepresented buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement. Okay. Continued right to compensation. Okay. And then it defines here who a prospective buyer is. So remember that continued compensation was due for prospective buyers. That is someone who physically entered and was shown the property during the listing period or any extension by broker or any other broker, or for whom the broker or any other broker submitted a seller signed written offer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property. Okay, so somebody who physically entered. Now, keep in mind, other agents are showing our properties. They have buyers. Oftentimes, when Adriana wants to show my listing, I don't get the name of her buyers. Okay, might be a good practice to start asking for those names so that we can put it in here in case we decide to cancel the listing or the listing doesn't sell and it goes to expired, that continuation period be valid for those buyers. Okay, if I ask another agent for their buyers' names, they might feel a little defensive, be like, I don't have to tell you that information. You can be like, I don't have to show you the property. No, we don't want to have that game, but we can say, hey, Adriana, you don't have to worry because you have a signed buyer representation agreement with those buyers. I need it because my listing period or my listing agreement has a continuation period. So in the effect that we don't get this property sold, and your buyer decides to circumvent us and try to go around and make an offer directly with our seller, I want to protect both you and I and make sure we get paid for our efforts. So what's your buyer's name? I'm not contacting them directly. It just allows me that if they try to contact my seller directly, I can reach back out to you and make sure you get protected, right? So it's all in how you sell it. Let's see here. We are going to provide the notice of prospective buyers in the case that this agreement is canceled or expires. And 3 is seller interference with listing. If without broker's prior written consent, property is withdrawn from sale, conveyed, leased, rented, or otherwise transferred or made unmarketable by a voluntary act of the seller during the listing period, if any, or any extension, you would be due compensation. So if the seller's like, oh, by the way, Sadie, we decided to rent the property, so yeah, it's not for sale anymore. And I know we didn't sign the cancellation of the listing, but we've got a tenant in it already, or we've got a tenant moving in next week. Sadie could be like, perfect, because we didn't have this conversation before you rented it. I'm actually due compensation. Okay. Additional compensation terms, buyer breach and seller recovery of damages, right? So if the buyer breaches, seller gets some of that deposit. You might be due some of that, those funds. Escrow instructions, Seller hereby irrevocably assigns broker the above compensation from seller's funds. This is your instructions to title and escrow that these funds belong to you in the case of, well, for any reason of compensation, even if it's a closed, successful sale. Seller compensation obligations to other brokerages, right? They need to disclose that information to you. The maximum listing period, which was 24 months unless it's owned by an entity. Items included and excluded, right? It's talking about, hey, unless otherwise specified in the real estate purchase agreement, all fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property are included and personal property items are excluded from the purchase price. Seller intends to specify. I've got a whole email that draws this out for my sellers that they get after they sign the listing agreement before the property goes active, that talks about what's a fixture and a fitting, what should be included and what maybe wouldn't be included, and ask them, is there anything that might be gray area that you don't want to include in the sale? Let's put those on a list, right? Because sometimes like decorative shelving, even though the intention is not that it's there permanently, it is sometimes attached to the wall, which would consider it a fixture. So sometimes we want to make sure we clarify and identify those items. I had somebody get in contract on a property. Yeah, Sadie, it causes huge issues, which is why I've turned it into an email format and I make sure I have these conversations with my sellers. We had a agent in our office get in contract on a property with some buyers, and like day 3 or 4, the listing agent came back and said, oh, and by the way, the sellers are taking the chandelier and they don't want to include this and they don't want to do that and they don't want to do the other. And obviously, because we were in contract, we could have pushed the issue, or that agent could have pushed the issue. However, her buyers just decided it wasn't worth it and walked away from the deal. So things like that need to be addressed ahead of time. And if I've got a seller that is like, hey, yeah, chandelier, I don't want to include that, I'm going to say, let's replace it before we go on the market because we don't want to sell it. Bookshelf attached to the wall, earthquake strap. So seller was able to not leave. Yeah, but the buyer's right. Yeah, absolutely. Like earthquake strapping, it talks about that in the purchase agreement. Actually, it identifies that like strapping to attach it to the wall for safety issues doesn't make it a fixture. But those types of things can get construed incorrectly or interpreted wrong. Or maybe we've got a shed in the backyard that's not actually attached to the cement in the backyard, so it doesn't have to stay. Seller intends to take it with them. So things like that, like we just want to have those conversations like, hey, is that shed attached to the ground? Are you leaving it? Right? I had an issue on one of my transactions. There was cabinets in the garage. Sellers took them with them. And I said, hey, sellers, like buyers are really upset. And they weren't attached to the wall. They weren't even screwed to the wall. They were just sitting there. And I go, perfect. Can you show me, like, do you have any pictures so we could see that or whatever? I think it happened right before the close of escrow. I think the other agent, because they were packing and moving stuff away from the wall and they moved those and they said, yeah, they weren't attached. So there's no holes, no anything. Anyways, so lots of things can cause issues. So it's good to have those conversations. And make sure ahead of time, like, hey, so you've got cabinets in your garage. Are you leaving those, the shelving, right? Whatever it might be. Generally speaking, bookshelves, you usually don't cause an issue. But you had one that did. So yeah, earthquake strap. So it's good to make sure that you go over with your buyers what might be included, as well as with sellers about what they should or should not include. Seller representation. Just talking about, hey, like there's not delinquent amounts, there's no notice of default, there's no bankruptcies, right? There's not any special assessments that we don't know about, or the seller's going to tell us about that stuff. Broker's responsibility, authority, and limitations is section 7A, right? We agree to exercise reasonable care and effort and due diligence to achieve the purposes of this agreement unless seller gives broker written instructions. The contrary, broker is authorized but not required to order reports and disclosures, including those specified in 7E. As necessary, advertise and market the property by any method and any medium selected by broker, including MLS, internet, social media, and to the extent permitted by these medias, control and disseminate the dissemination of information submitted to any medium, and disclose to any real estate licensee making inquiry the receipt of any offers on the property and the offering price of such offers. Presentations, right? Different strategy for obtaining offers. Sellers advise that certain buyers may prefer not to be in a competitive situation, either not make an offer if there's instruction that all offers will be presented at a later date, or try to make a preemptive offer that will expire shortly, hoping the seller will accept before the presentation date. Additionally, certain buyers may not be able or allowed to pay compensation to buyer's broker. These buyers may request for the seller to pay through the term of the purchase agreement or through separate compensation agreement. Seller is advised to discuss and consider the best strategy for seller related to presentation of offers. And then it goes into, hey, we're going to instruct offers to be presented promptly or at a later date and time. Buyer supplemental offer letters, right? Those buyer letters, again, the default is we're not going to submit buyer letters to our sellers to help them make an emotional decision. It does turn that decision emotional. I have had buyers, lots of buyers, that have written letters to sellers that sellers have read and decided to go with my buyer because the letter was amazing and stellar, and they made an emotional decision over a business one. We want to make sure that our sellers understand that we're helping them make the decision that puts their sell their house for the best terms that work for the seller and not make an emotional decision. So we will not present buyer letters is usually the default, usually how I explain it. Now, after they accept the offer, if they want to read a buyer letter, I have no problem letting them read that letter. Seller good faith. Seller agrees to consider offers presented by broker and to act in good faith to accomplish the sale of the property, among other things, making the property available for showing at reasonable times and subject to paragraph 2C4, referring to broker all inquiries of any party interested in the property. Seller is responsible for determining what price to list and sell the property. Here's the investigation and reports, these pre-listing investigations. Undisclosed conditions, incomplete or incorrect information. Seller agrees to indemnify, defend, and hold broker harmless from all claims, disputes, litigation, judgments, and costs arising from any incorrect or incomplete information supplied by seller or from any material facts that seller knows but fails to disclose, including dangerous or hidden conditions on the property, right? Be careful with what you disclose. Like seller says, oh yeah, I know tax records say it says 2,000 square feet, but it's actually 2,150. Make sure to, if you're going to go 2,150, that you put the source as the seller and you put like buyer to verify, right? But we want to be careful with what we disseminate out there. I was involved in a lawsuit because the property was marketed as a property that could be, it had two homes on it. And it said that the first one was kept under 1,500 square feet or whatever the limit was for that county for the second home, but that they left room in the attic to expand it to 3,000 feet to double the square footage, but that subdivision of the property would have to take place in order to make that happen, right? So expansion with subdivision is how it was marketed. Yeah, come to find out the seller had actually previously tried to subdivide the property and add to the property, and it had been denied. And so my buyers bought it with the assumption that they could subdivide it because it was said, and then they couldn't. And it was a big lawsuit. It was a mess. It was a mess. Anyways, so make sure to be careful that they verified or put seller says right in your marketing that property can be expanded with subdivision, so that you're not making that claim as if you verified or not verified that information. C is possible dual agency, right? Just talks about potentially competing buyers and sellers, showing properties, disclosure and consent. So all those information. I do highly recommend that you go through and read this entire listing agreement. There is so much good stuff tucked into these paragraphs that you may want to point out to your sellers in the purchase agreement, both sellers and buyers. There's stuff that should be pointed out, also helps you negotiate and all those. Here's your unrepresented buyers, right? If buyer refuses to be represented by broker, seller authorizes broker to obtain a signed document from such buyer. Refusing representation by broker, broker shall provide such buyers at the earliest practical time and disclosure of non-representation. Or, oh, we've run out of time. Wah, wah, wah. It's always a failure when it bows out like that. And it's It's 9:56. So instead of taking the next 5 minutes to reopen my car forms, I'm going to end it for the day. We're going to pick up on the listing agreement, not next week, but the week after. We will pick up where we left off and then also cover the MLSA. And then we will talk about some of these other forms that will also attach. So we'll start diving into those. So sorry that it ended a little abruptly there. I apologize. We'll pick that up again, like I said. And then we'll cover some of those forms like the TDS and the SBQ and the exempt seller disclosure and our mobile home listing addendum and our probate and our trust advisory, right? So all of those things, we will start covering those in 2 weeks. So I won't see you next week, but I'll see you the week after. Anybody have any questions before we wrap up today? There you go. All right, y'all, I will see you guys in 2 weeks. Have fun. If anybody has questions before then, feel free to reach out. Talk to you guys soon.